Without further ado, our first speaker tonight is Liam Sturgess. Liam is a Vancouver-based musician, music producer, and writer. During the COVID-19 crisis, Liam identified the need for regular people to become involved in opposing government overreach and developing solutions to real issues of public health and civil liberties. To that end, he joined the Canadian COVID Care Alliance on the External Communications Committee, supporting frontline doctors and healthcare professionals across Canada in their effort to raise awareness on important topics such as the immune system, informed consent, and the role of conflicts of interest in Canada's COVID-19 response. He was a founding co-host and producer of the Rounding the Earth podcast and is now an investigative reporter for the Kennedy Beacon, as well as his own Substack called Microjourneys. Liam recently co-founded White Rose Intelligence, an open source research firm with a focus on human rights. Tonight, Liam's going to tell us about a very interesting person, Allan Seckel, the amalgamator of all the colleges under the HPOA. Liam, welcome.
Thank you so much, York. That was a lovely introduction, and thank you all for having me here tonight. As York said, I represent, the way I see it, the average person who understands that something bigger than all of us is happening in terms of COVID and the national response, but also our province here. We've got permanent changes being made to how I, as a regular person, can access or not access healthcare or any allied medical care. And so I'm very happy to be contributing what I can. I have some slides. I'll also say, as you see in the subtitle here, this is very much a brief introduction to Allan Seckel, the man leading BC's regulatory college amalgamation. So I just want to emphasize this will not be totally exhaustive. There's more to it than can possibly be presented tonight, but I did want to give you just a brief introduction to the reports that I've prepared and the ongoing Freedom of Information Act request that I've filed. If we could go to the next slide, please. And just to briefly mention, as York said, I recently founded White Rose Intelligence, which is a research and intelligence firm using open source intelligence, working on projects just like this one, trying to understand, using information that is available to anybody, how exactly our systems work, particularly as they affect individual liberties. Things like access to healthcare. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so here's the background. So in September of last year, I was asked to do an investigation into this gentleman, Allan Seckel, who is a mysterious man who was put in charge of amalgamating the colleges under the Health Occupations or Health Professions and Occupations Act. I identified a number of things which I would describe as conflicts of interest. You might call them perceived conflicts of interest. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of those tonight. And then at the end of my little spiel here, I'm going to explain what's happened with a Freedom of Information Act request, or FIPA, that I filed for the details on his appointment, because there's some unanswered questions. And then I will explain the call to action or the next steps. Next slide, please. Okay, so in July of 2023, according to various colleges, Allan Seckel was appointed by the Minister of Health under the old act, the Health Professions Act. That is the power that was exercised to appoint him to lead the amalgamation of the colleges. Now, interestingly, it's not on the slide, but I just want to note, I was reminded today when I revisited Allan Seckel's LinkedIn profile that according to him, he was actually appointed in March 2023. So this is an example of the kind of question we're seeking answers to through the FIPA request. Next slide, please. This is another important date, which is the day one, amalgamation day one is June 2024. Now, I don't fully understand what that means. I get the impression that's when the process that we're in right now completes, and that in June 2024, we're actually dealing with the amalgamated colleges. But again, I'm not entirely certain what that means, but hold that date, June 2024, in mind. Next slide, please. So the key questions I was asked to answer were, what exactly is Allan Seckel's job as his appointment, as he was appointed? And also, is he qualified or even possibly disqualified from being in charge of setting up the new amalgamated colleges? And that was based on some very legitimate initial questions that were brought to me, particularly about his lack of experience in the area. Next slide, please. So this is the part of the Health Professions Act that is relevant. This is what was invoked to appoint him to lead the amalgamation. And for the sake of time, I won't read this entire thing, but this is available to you if you like. And let me just see. Yeah, next slide, please. So let's jump into the conflicts of interest part. So right now, these are all of the agencies, crown corporations, that Allan Seckel holds senior level leadership positions at, concurrently with his appointment by the Minister of Health to amalgamate the colleges. As you can see, we got BC Housing, ICBC, which is our car insurance, Legal Aid BC, TransLink, and WorkSafe BC. And by simultaneously holding senior positions in all of these organizations, Seckel holds significant influence over a wide range of aspects of the day-to-day lives of British Columbians, including healthcare, housing, insurance, legal affairs, travel, employment, and employment safety. And yeah, that's significant, and that was striking to me. And just to answer the question of what exactly his job with the Ministry of Health is, it appears to be that he is to lead the amalgamations as a clear decision maker with respect to amalgamation-related decisions. And based on the Health Professions Act, he's been granted the authority to exercise the powers and perform the duties of a board for the regulatory colleges in BC as applicable to the process of amalgamation. All right, next slide, please. So on the topic of his education and his experience, like, is he the right guy for the job, really, is the question. Well, here's a brief overview of his basic education. He Bachelor of Arts in Commerce from SFU, and then Bachelor in Law and a Master in Law. And this, combined with additional education he had later, shorter term, he's got economics, commerce, and law under his belt, which, in my opinion, is very helpful for a bureaucrat, which this gentleman by definition is. But he has no medical training or training in any kind of these allied health professions that also find themselves under now his authority. Next slide, please. He does, however, maybe the closest thing he has to experience in medicine is he was the CEO of the Doctors of BC, which used to be called the British Columbia Medical Association. And next slide, please. He also held some very senior positions in the province itself, right? You know, the halls of power. He was Deputy Attorney General for British Columbia, and then he led the BC Public Service, was Cabinet Secretary and Deputy Minister to the Premier. So not at all insignificant for a bureaucrat. Next slide, please. Oops. Yeah, and I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I can't remember. The author of this piece might actually be on this call. But I just can't recall off the top of my head. But I do want to quote here from this section. This is very notable, because when Allan Seckel was the head of the BC Public Service Agency, it's my understanding he was responsible for changing legislation related to restrictions on public servants after they leave office in terms of employment, and that Allan Seckel participated in changing that, I believe, in a way that wound up being favorable to him once he left office and needed to invoke these provisions. I'll just read this quote here. Allan Seckel, while head of the BC Public Service Agency, was the architect of amendments to allow the head of the PSA to waive the conditions of employment under special circumstances. When Allan Seckel left the Premier's office in March 2011, and shortly thereafter started working for the British Columbia Medical Association, or Doctors of BC, he triggered the need for exemptions to be granted to him by his successor to the new head of the PSA, Linda Torres. So excellent journalism there. And for the third time, I'm sorry, I can't recall the name of the author off the top of my head, but it is in the documentation, which is available to you all. Next slide, please. And from there, he's just held a series of public and private positions that are markedly conflicting, in my opinion. For example, he served on the board of a nonprofit organization called Lift Impact Partners, or Lift Philanthropy Partners, from 2015 to 2019. And what's notable about this, long story super short, is it was a client of a lobbying firm called Strategies West Consulting, which I was familiar with already because of a prior investigation where I looked into another BC government agency lead named Mark McKinnon. Strategies West Consulting lobbied Mark McKinnon on behalf of the British Columbia Dental Association. And if we go to the next slide, this is the lobbying activity report, and you'll see the purpose of it was discussing the process that the Ministry of Health will be following to amalgamate current oral health care colleges into one oral health care college. So there's some interesting behind the scenes connections there related to lobbying. So that's one position. Next slide, please. Another interesting position, he was a member of the TELUS Friendly Future Foundation's Vancouver and Coastal Community Board from 2012 to 2019, which will be relevant for reasons we'll elaborate on here. Next slide, please. He simultaneously was on the board of Covenant House Vancouver. And he now is chair of that particular board. Now, why are these two organizations relevant? Well, the TELUS Friendly Future Foundation Vancouver board gave $20,000 to Covenant House Vancouver in 2020, which, again, just whenever there's these connections and then movements of big sums of money, it's notable to me. The other reason why this is notable to me is in the COVID era, if we go to the next slide, one of the donors, there's the $20,000 that Covenant House received. Sorry, next slide. But one of the donors to this TELUS Friendly Future Foundation is a company called Gene Worldwide, which is a creative advertising agency whose clientele include not only TELUS, but also Janssen, Johnson & Johnson, which developed a COVID-19 vaccine product, which was deployed in limited form in Canada. And then also just a couple other organizations with various financial interests in the handling of specifically the COVID response. Next slide, please. And then one more that's very interesting, you should know. Fasken Martineau Dumoulin gave a significant amount of money to the TELUS Friendly Future Foundation, and Allan Seckel began his career at Fasken Martineau Dumoulin, or in its predecessor firm. So the summary in this part one here is that there's enough, to me, circumstantial evidence of just interesting flows of money between organizations that Seckel had or has influence over that warrant further look. They may not mean anything. They may. I don't know. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are a number, basically this part of the investigation is ongoing, where I was also asked subsequently to look at how much money basically he's been paid in his various positions. And indeed, he does appear to be well paid compared to his colleagues in similar positions, but I want to just focus on one specific perceived conflict of interest, which is that he simultaneously sits on the board. In fact, I think he is chair of, he is. He is currently serving as the chair of the board for both Covenant House Vancouver and BC Housing. Covenant House Vancouver is a private nonprofit. BC Housing is an agency of the provincial government. And this is a problem. Why? It's a problem because BC Housing is a funding partner of Covenant House Vancouver. They do lots of projects together. They collaborate on important aspects of the social welfare system in the province, related to housing. If we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, and so basically that on its own, on its face, to me, I have no idea how it's legal for him to simultaneously chair both BC Housing and Covenant House Vancouver. And also, I just want to point out that BC Housing also gave $321,000 in service payments to Fasken Martineau Dumoulin, which again is where Allan Seckel started his career. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the final phase in my little presentation here. Maybe you're like me, you feel that there's a lot of unanswered questions, including just who is this guy? Maybe some of you, I'm a young guy. I wasn't around for most of Allan Seckel's career. Perhaps some of you are familiar, while he was in these various positions, attorney general, so on and so forth. But I don't know this guy. I'd like to know more. And there is a striking lack of any documentation of any kind anywhere, including in BC's open government database. There's no published FIPA requests, which is not standard as far as my experience has gone. So I filed a Freedom of Information Act request, or FIPA, it's called at the provincial level. And on October 17, 2023, I asked, provide all responsive records regarding the July 2023 appointment of Allan Seckel to participate in the amalgamation of British Columbia's regulatory colleges. Include emails, text messages, calendar holds, briefing notes, handwritten notes, slideshows, presentations, videos, audio recordings, contracts, and drafts, and then provide a reference to why, where I got this initial information and the date range, 2018 to 2023. This is pretty standard language for a FIPA request as I've learned to do them. And I was expecting this to be a very easy request for them to fulfill. Next slide, please. So here's a timeline. Here's what's happened. The spoiler alert is it has not gone smoothly. And this was submitted to the province of British Columbia. I think the Ministry of Health is who I asked. Anyway, they acknowledged receipt on October 18, 2023. That made the original due date for the request November 29, 2023. On November 16, 2023, I got an email informing me that it was going to cost $135 in their initial fee estimate. So it could wind up costing more later. And this was due to the volume of records that they'd have to go through. So behind the scenes, we talked about it, decided this was a worthwhile expenditure given the content and the number of records we were likely to receive. And so I paid that and then I got a receipt November 24, 2023. Oh, there's a typo there. Forgive me. So that made the new due date January 15, 2024. But then, just as that deadline was coming up on January 8th, I got an email from a junior analyst asking a 30-day extension. And usually, that's to be expected, kind of. What's not to be expected is that they provide no reason whatsoever for requesting the extension, which I told them. I said, in the absence of a reason as offered under the Act, we're going to have to, not consent to the extension. And if they had, if that 30 days would have given them until February 27, 2024. But then I got an email shortly after telling me that, separate from what they had already told me, they got an extension for 90 days from the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner. So they went to the person in charge of this in the government, asked for that, and got it. But again, the reasons are ambiguous if they're there at all. Next slide. Oh, sorry. So that makes now, as of today, they have a new due date of June 5th, 2024. But remember, June 2024 has come up before. Next slide, please. Because June 2024, if you recall from the beginning of my little spiel here, is day one of amalgamation, whatever that means. And so I find that very weird. Given the complete lack of a reasonable explanation so far for so aggressively delaying the release of these documents. Remember, what I'm asking for is just documents about like this gentleman being appointed to lead this very important transition. They're by law, they're meant to be publicly available, and it's my opinion, and I speak only for myself, that the only reasonable conclusion at this point is that the government of British Columbia is probably unlawfully blocking the disclosure of documents related to Allan Seckel's appointment. I cannot believe that somebody there thought this through, said, okay, well, when's this process ending? Or when is this phase of the process, wrapping up? June 2024. Okay, well, that sounds like a good time to delay the release of documents related to this process so that, well, let's just say the result is it becomes much more difficult to do anything about it if there were to be problems in the process. Next step, please. So, well, next steps indeed. So here's what I intend to do. I'm going to write a letter of objection to the Information Access Operations Office within the province. This is the required first step, and basically saying what I just told you, which is there's been no reasonable explanation provided, and again, by law under FIPA, they have to, if they are to delay, it must be a reasonable explanation and it must be reasonably explained. And if that doesn't work, then we will file a formal objection with the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner. And with any luck, that will help. But regardless, at this point, what I believe needs to be done, perhaps as a group here tonight, I believe this is primo for discussion with the media, because to me it is transparently a non-transparent activity that they're engaged in. If this transition affects, which it does, every single person's ability to access healthcare, or the way in which they access healthcare, or their various alternative therapies, anything at all related to health and well-being is affected by this. And this applies not only to citizens, but to visitors, to non-permanent residents, then this is a matter of public interest. And it is absolutely ludicrous that the government would delay until it's too late to do anything. So the media should have their opportunity to amplify this. And there's a possibility we may benefit from, in this process, some legal assistance. It's not necessary at this point, but if there were to be somebody who wanted to step forward and help on that end, it could be tremendously helpful. So there, I've definitely gone over my time, but just wanted to thank you again for giving me the chance to share briefly some of my findings.